Hi and welcome to lesson number 2 in superannuation basics in the Australian environment. I'm Scott Trevor, the Managing Director and Founder of Go Global Bookkeeping, just here presenting the second lesson. Now in the first lesson, if you recall, we talked about the overall environment, what the difference between an age pension was and superannuation and what superannuation meant. Remember, that's the old people who were redundant, so people who were redundant as a result of age. Were entitled to be superannuated out of the workforce. And then there was also the interaction between that and the age pension. And we talked about the key date of 1992, which was when the federal legislation came in to introduce the compulsory superannuation into Australia. Now in this lesson, we're just going to extend on that a little bit further. We're going to talk about the way that the scheme works before we get into some of the complexities in the third lesson around the superannuation environment. So without any further ado, so superannuation, as I might have mentioned in the first lesson, really started as a pension in the 1800s. So it goes right back to the foundation of Australia. It covered back those days just industrial workers, and it was part of their award scheme. So if you were a dock worker, a lot of Australians were involved in shipping, and they were unloading ships and putting those goods into town, and a lot of them were also shearers. They used to shear sheep, and those workers were industrialised into unions, and as part of those unions they negotiated special rates that would pay them money into a fund that would pay for their retirement, because they knew they were doing hard physical labour. They couldn't do hard physical labour for as long as the less manual people, so the people who owned businesses or were lawyers or doctors, they could work later. So when these people got to age 50, 55, they were pretty worn out. So they needed some sort of money that was set aside for them. And that's how the superannuation or pension scheme really started way back in the 1800s. Public servants. So it also covered those people that earned a lot less salary than those people that might have worked on the docks, because they work for the government. And when you work for a government job, you have job security, but you don't necessarily have the salary. And I'm sure that's the case in Cebu and the Philippines in general, as it is in Australia as well. So in 1992, as I mentioned, the Superannuation Guarantee Act was introduced. And compulsory superannuation was born. Now the way that worked, and I remember because I was in the workforce back then, was that you had to take part of your salary and put that towards superannuation. So when it started off, it was 3%. The rate was 3% of my salary. So I wasn't on 100,000 back in those days, but if I was on 100,000, then I would have to take 3% of that, so that's $3,000 before tax, and put that into a superannuation fund. Now, there weren't that many choices. In fact, I didn't have any choice back then. My employer got to choose what superannuation fund to put that into. And they took the $3,000 out of my salary and paid it direct before tax and paid it off to the superannuation fund, and I didn't see it. I'm like, well, I just got a 3% pay cut. And that's what happened when it first came in. So that rate's grown now to 9.5%. So it's 9.5% of a person's total salary package is called compulsory superannuation. And that superannuation goes before tax into a special superannuation fund. And that is a fund that has been established for the purposes of taking superannuation contributions. Now, there's many and varied funds, and I'll explain them in a later lesson. But suffice to say that the money goes into a special superannuation fund. Now there are plans to take the superannuation rate up to a whopping 12%. So it's 9.5% at the moment. And in fact, most of our software on Xero and things has given up trying to keep up with the rate, and it just says whatever the government mandated rate is, because it was changing every year and then it was stalling and it wasn't changing, and we never know until the last minute what the rate's actually going to be. As I said, it's meant to go up to 12% or even higher, but at the moment it's stalled at 9.5%. And that's because wages growth is very low in Australia in this current season that we're in. When wages start to increase again, then I'm sure the superannuation contribution rate will also increase as well. So how does it work? I've just mentioned to you, so the way that it works is that the the business just takes, at the moment, 9.5% of your salary. So if you're paid monthly, then they take 9.5% of your gross before tax salary, and they put that into a superannuation fund. Now, while I'm speaking of what the 9.5% is of, it's of ordinary times earnings. And that is what you ordinarily will earn in the hours that you work. Now, it covers things, doesn't cover overtime because that's not ordinary, but it does cover things like shift allowances, of course your annual salary, meal allowances, and those things may well have the 9.5% on them, but that's where it gets a little bit complicated. So if you've got a very complicated payroll, some things might have superannuation on them and some might not. So it's very important to work out what is ordinary time earnings and what's not, and what's got superannuation on it and what doesn't have superannuation on it. But remember, it's not the employer paying 9.5% on top of an employee's salary. It's a whatever your employee's salary is, 9.5% goes off to superannuation and the rest goes to them. And remember, it's before tax. Just a quick note on when you can take superannuation. So you can take your superannuation when you meet a condition of release. And I'll explain that more in the next lesson when we talk about more of the complexities in relation to superannuation. But when you retire permanently from the workforce, that's when you can take your superannuation, and not before. So beforehand you can't do it. When you retire permanently from the workforce, you can take it, and it's generally then tax-free. And I'll explain more about the taxes in the next lesson. But you can't just take it along the journey. You have to do it, wait till you're ready to retire, and then you can take it. And remember, it's there to supplement you in retirement. You can take it as a lump sum or as a pension. It's designed to be taken as a pension, but if you want, you can take it as a lump sum. And that was causing some problems in the early days of superannuation, where people thought, great, I've got a couple of $100,000 saved up in my superannuation fund. I'll take it out, I'll buy a new car, I'll go on a world cruise, I'll have a wonderful old time for the first few years, and I'll spend all that money. And then I'll go to the government and say, I've got no more money and I need to get the pension. And that's what has to happen. So now there's some changes in thinking about the way that superannuation has to be handled, and also your eligibility of the age pension, which means that there's a real possibility that if you take a lot of money and blow it, that you'll run out of funds and you'll be looking for family and friends to help you live, which is an odd situation in a country like Australia. That's all I wanted to cover today. So I just wanted to, in this lesson, I just wanted to further emphasise and put some more colour and shading around superannuation basics. We'll get into some of the complexities of superannuation in the next lesson. So get a paper and pen and get ready to start taking notes, because there's a lot of different points and a lot of different complexities that we're going to delve into in the next lesson.